As I walked in, there was a break in the Today Show. They said a small plane had hit the World Trade Center. And I thought, okay, there's no way with the flight paths that plane could have accidentally hit. And all of a sudden, the second plane hit.
I remember I turned on the TV and I just thought, could this day get any worse? And right before my eyes, it did.
I was taking my younger daughter to school, and I had NPR on, and I heard somebody from inside the Pentagon saying that the Pentagon had been attacked. That was the first I knew about it. And so I dropped her off at school, and I started flipping around the news stations, and I realized it wasn't just the Pentagon, but one of the towers had been hit of the World Trade Center. And I remember thinking, this is going to change this whole day.
So I'm getting pretty close to my subway entrance, which was on a busy street, 7th Avenue in New York, and I noticed that there was this throng of people standing around. Like even in the street, traffic was just stopped, and everybody was staring downtown. So I walked up, and I looked to where they were all looking, and I saw that one of the trade towers was on fire.
Several thousand people had just died at the hands of lunatics. It's hard to come up with a word for what to call them because you just don't know how to label people like that. I'm trying more and more not to demonize people who view things in the other way that I do. In situations like this, I feel like it's impossible not to demonize someone who does something like this. You can't. It's a demonic thing. It's an evil, heartless, cold, destructive thing.
I just flipped on the TV, and I saw smoke coming out of the first tower. And, at first they just said a plane collided. We thought, it just went off course and hit the tower. And so we sat there for a little bit, and we saw the second plane. And what popped in my head was, we're Muslims. I hope this wasn't a Muslim who did this.
I happened to be there on business, staying at the hotel, and I felt the building shook, like I imagined, though I've never been in one. It felt kind of like an earthquake.
I remember back at the World Trade Center, we were walking towards the elevator and we didn't see the sign that said wet floor. And there was some maintenance guy there mopping it. I was just thinking, wondering, was he in the building when it happened?
Just walking down the street, you could see people who were hurt or injured, and you knew that they had to be in the World Trade Center. And later walking down the street, you could smell death. You could smell what it would smell like if someone was being burned. I'll never forget that smell.
Even in Lincoln, Nebraska, people were canceling classes, and it was these nationwide results of today's events. And that's pretty heavy duty, if you can imagine. This one event where people are canceling classes and going home from work to be with their loved ones, or just stopping what they're doing so that they can watch TV or whatever they do.
My dad was an airline pilot and was flying on United Airlines at the time. And one of those planes was the same type that my dad flew. I was trying to get a hold of my mom, and like I said, their only communication was regular phone lines at the time. There were so many people that were trying to get a hold of my mom that I think it was 6 hours before I actually got through to her.
So I'm driving down L Street in my little Ford Fiesta wearing one of my African dresses, and a guy in a big red pickup truck tried to run me off the road and kept bumping into me quite a few times down L Street. He kept screaming things at me. I don't know what he was saying because I rolled my windows up, and it was a hot day, and it was just this tiny car in this huge red truck.
I remember how 9/11 really affected people in this country, and my wife and I were shielded from it since we were in Ecuador. But while it was intense and we couldn't believe it, we didn't have the deep scars that people did who were in America at the time because we were very isolated for what was happening there. Having it in your face 24/7, that's what I didn't understand.
We lived in Brooklyn, and we lived in a couple different places in Brooklyn. So I used to take her places before our son was born. And I could do this. And she's a pretty interesting human being. So we used to go places as a family, neat places in Manhattan, all sorts of neat places to go. I don't remember why. My wife and I were talking about this. We were thinking it was about when you were 6 or 7 years old.
I think maybe 6 or 7, yeah. This would be 1976, 1977, something like that.
We were about to go live someplace else, and we thought, well, We gotta get up there and take Maria up to see the World Trade Center. I don't think of it as ground zero. It's the World Trade Center. So we lived in Brooklyn, right up in here. It's called South Brooklyn, but it looks north on the map. I don't know why that is. Then Brooklyn Bridge goes right up in here into Lower Manhattan. So one day we just got on the subway and took it to the stop right at the World Trade Center, the one that got destroyed. And we took the elevator up to the observation area, which is fabulous. Well, was fabulous. You could see for miles.
Weather permitting.
Weather permitting, and smog and fog. But oftentimes when you were at the World Trade Center, you were above the clouds. The clouds were here and you were here. And seeing out in the Atlantic Ocean, and the panorama was fantastic. So that's what we did that day. Went up to see that, Maria and I.
We didn't take my mother. We don't know why. Stephen was still little.
Yeah, he was too small to go.
Yeah.
I think he was too little to go. And yeah, we didn't take him.
We all saw the second attack, and my mind immediately goes to this time when I'm at the top of that thing with my father, and I watched it crash. And I looked around at all these people who were in Des Moines, Iowa, and I said, I was there. I was on the top of that thing. And somewhere in your mind, it's completely crazy, but the imagination takes over, and you kind of think, wow, I rode up in that elevator, and I watch it crash. And I absolutely do feel personal because I was there, and I was there with my father. And I remember going up and looking out over the edge, even though you wouldn't let me look through those things.
You put money in it so you could see.
I don't know what these things are called. You put a quarter in them. Binoculars. But they were paid binoculars.
Yeah, that's what they were, but you pay for them.
And he would not let me look through them.
Well, I thought they wouldn't work too well.
So it wouldn't have been worth the quarter, so I guess. But I vividly remember going up and looking out over the edge, and they were doing some kind of solar experiment. But those of us who are a little older will always remember. Every generation has that moment.
That really is when it gets personal, and you think about that kind of thing.
It was my first year of teaching, so since it happened in September, I had been on my own in the classroom for less than a month. So I was very much a rookie and very much caught off guard in what to say and how to explain this to students. And I was teaching in Madison, Nebraska, which is a small town, rural. Like their entire school is the size of a freshman class. So it was very small. And we all had TVs in our room up in the corner of the classroom, so we were able to watch throughout the day. And the actual towers falling happened during my plan period, which I was very thankful for because I cried. What struck me the most, or I guess what I remember the most as far as what I told my students, is because they wanted to know why. And they were surprised by the fact that I don't know if they use these words, but the kind of gist of it was, how could anyone hate us that much? That they would do that to us? Why? Why would anyone do that to us? So I ended up talking to my students saying, well, the reason they get so angry with us is because our country, a lot of the times in the United States, we get involved in things that maybe we shouldn't, and we tend to kind of throw our weight around, and we'll come in and we'll say, here's what you need to do. So yeah, you can imagine how you feel having that happen to you. When trauma happens, it makes me aware of the fact that kids look to me to give them a reason why, and that I can't always give a reason why. And it makes me aware of how careful I have to be with what I say, because I understand that they might take that to heart. And so on some subjects, I have to be really careful of how I phrase things, because it can really change people's perspectives. I remember it so clearly, but my students, they don't anymore. I teach mostly freshmen, so I get in my 14 and 15-year-olds, and they have no memory of this event. And it's a reminder of how much things have changed. You know, that the possibility of terrorism hitting home is just part of life that they are aware of and they just deal with. Whereas my students at the time, the thought that that could ever occur never occurred to them. And that's part of what shook everybody up. You know, that's something that happens over there. That doesn't happen over here, that happens there. And that changed people's perspectives a lot, I think. Whereas kids today, like I said, it's just a part of life that you are aware of and that you just deal with.
I'm from Long Island, and Long Island is just outside of Manhattan, so basically I had friends' parents who passed away in the Trade Center due to various reasons. Like, some parents actually worked there, and a couple other parents were firefighters who died like trying to save other people. I remember at the time I was in 7th grade, and it may have been 6th grade. Hold on. It was 6th grade, yes. One of my friends, Ryan, his dad was a firefighter, and I remember for a couple of days after the attacks, they couldn't find him. And like, he kept coming into school and being like, I don't know where my dad is and all that, but like, I don't know if they ever found his remains, but you know, like, he did die. So yeah, we had a memorial service for his father maybe 2 or 3 weeks after the attacks when we realized that he had passed away. And there were some other people in my middle school, because I was in middle school at the time, whose parents had passed away, but they weren't like, they were acquaintances to me, they weren't like friends of mine, but Brian was my friend, and yeah, that was sad. And I remember everybody was really angry and nobody really understood that, like, I don't know, that the race didn't have anything to do with it. It was just this group of people who were extremists who decided that they were going to do this and kill innocent people. But for a while after that, the racism was really bad, like at my school, because there were kids who were like Arab at my school and they would really be bullied a lot and they didn't feel comfortable coming to school and stuff. One of the girls, she was my friend, but she was really bullied a lot. Like, they would call her terrorists and stuff, and it was sad, but that's kind of how people dealt with it. I didn't really refer to people like that because, I don't know, but for a while after that, people, even in like high school, people would still refer to them as terrorists and say like, oh, that terrorist, and it was really bad. I don't know, I guess I feel like my innocence was like taken away because I didn't, no, not like that. Well, you know what I mean. I felt like, I don't know, I felt like I lived in a bubble before this, and like, now I realize that people could do terrible things to people who didn't deserve it, and I never got that until this, because nothing like that had ever happened in my lifetime. I mean, yes, I'd heard of all these wars like World War I and World War II and like these wars that were like far, far away in the past, but I never like experienced it firsthand where people I knew were affected by it, and that's where I realized that this world is full of people who can hurt others even though they're innocent. And people I knew where parents were killed, and it's like crazy to think that one day their mother or father was here and the next day they're gone, and there's no reason for it because they didn't do anything to deserve that. It was just really unfair. I just remember I felt really bad for all these kids because like, that's not fair to them. They didn't deserve that. Their family didn't deserve that. They were going to work that day. They were to work at the Trade Center to save people being firefighter or policemen, and they didn't know they weren't going to come back that day, you know?
As a kid, always loving the idea of New York. And in the 4th grade, we could choose any city we wanted to study. I chose New York. And I've always thought the skyline was so impressive compared to Omaha. Like, we only have the one skyscraper, only a few buildings. And New York just made Omaha look so sad. And so I've always been excited about New York City and the World Trade Center. The Twin Towers to me are just this big symbol of power and awesomeness, I'll say. And as for 9/11 in particular, people say you always remember where you were when things like that happen, which is very true. I was a freshman here at South at the time, and I can remember that morning the biggest news story was that Michael Jordan was going to play basketball again. It was the biggest story on every channel, and I can remember being like, this is news, who cares? Because I watched the Today Show before school. And so I went to school. First period was fine. It was honors English. And I walked out into the hallway and everything was just silent. And I remember being like, are people that concerned about Michael Jordan? Like, seriously? And there was just like this thickness in the air and I didn't know what it was. So I went to second period, which was orchestra. I saw the TV and I just assumed, oh, we're gonna watch a video today. And so I went to get my instrument, which is the viola. I sit down and I look up and the towers are on fire. And I even remember lunch that day, it was everyone talking about draft, and being 14, it's like, am I going to have to go to war for this? And so you just don't know what to do. And it's like, hey, we're being attacked, people have died. I'm watching people die on TV. And it's just having to wake up one day and have your entire viewpoint just change is terrible, especially being a young kid. And I even had this English teacher who was from Kenya, of Indian descent, and after 9/11, things got really awful for her. Like, she would still try to come in and teach, but it was still like, sorry guys, I almost got ran off the road today by someone who thought I had something to do with blowing up the World Trade Center. Things like that still happen today. It's irrational, but it's very true. And so I got to go to New York in 2005, about 4 or 5 years after it happened. And I remember just being disappointed because I had always loved the skyline. And now there was just this gaping hole where the World Trade Center used to be. And I went down to ground zero. It was all fenced off and essentially just this hole in the ground. And I remember when you're there, there's just this heaviness that you can't describe it. And they had the cross up there. And I'm not a particularly religious person, but that was a very powerful image. And when you're there, you forget about your plans. You forget what you were doing before and what you were going to do later. And you're just standing there and you're out of breath. And even today, it seems where it wasn't 5 or 10 years ago, it seems like it was yesterday. Like it was just yesterday.
Many years ago, this was my room. The day of September 11th, I had just finished doing the announcements, and I'd gone back to the office. As I walked in, there was a break in the Today Show. They said a small plane had hit the World Trade Center, and I was sort of stunned, and I stood there by my desk watching this, and seeing the smoke come out of the World Trade Center, and listening to them talk. And they said they had no idea how the small plane had hit, and they were talking, two-seater at the time. I immediately went over to the principal's office and was Mr. Barty then. I told him he needed to turn his TV on, and I said, there's something going on that might ultimately affect us here. And I said, it's in New York, so you need to see what's going on. From the time the second plane hit, they were talking about the possibility of 20 to 30,000 people killed by the two planes. And all of this we were watching it unfold that day, and so for several days, we really didn't know what to do, what to say. We continued on as much as possible, and then one of the kids asked, well, what does this do about our trip to New York? I hadn't even thought about it. So it took me a couple of days to talk with people, and some were, oh, I can't let my child go to New York. It's too dangerous a place. And others were saying, you can't stop, you just cannot go to something. This is something the kids have been working for. So finally I decided we would go ahead and go. It was just hard to get excited. All the travel arrangements were new because they had added all these restrictions. But we got through with any problems and got on the plane, and that's when the kids really started to get into it. They were really excited about going, and they weren't really thinking about 9/11 anymore. On Monday, we went over to Ellis Island, and it didn't hit me to look across New York Harbor to see the New York skyline and how it had changed without the two buildings there. And it wasn't until we were on the ferry going back to New York that I got the perspective of seeing the two towers that were gone, there's something wrong, but it sort of throws you out of kilter. So we walked through Battery Park, which is the park that's right at the south end of Manhattan, and all of a sudden, big globe. probably 20 feet across, and it was a modern-looking globe made out of bronze. And it was a globe that was in the courtyard of the World Trade Center. That's where it had been. And they had moved it down to a battery park so that it would be out of the way of construction, and people could still see it, and there was an eternal flame there with it. So that's sort of, everyone's been excited all along, and you see this, and it brings you back to reality. And so we all paused, and it's a very quiet moment. And New York is not a quiet place. And that's where I started noticing there was no traffic noise. There was no shouting. As we approached the World Trade Center, things got quieter, quieter, and quieter. And you turn the corner, and there's this massive hole with people working in it. And it's surrounded by a chain link fence. And on the fence are ties and ribbons and pictures and all sorts of things attached to it that family and friends and strangers had put on it. And my legs just collapsed. I just almost fell because that's where it really hit me. It hit the kids. They were just amazed on how quiet it was, how still it was. It was like we were in a holy place, and we didn't want to lose that feeling.
I was taking my younger daughter to school, and I had NPR on, and I heard somebody from inside the Pentagon saying that the Pentagon had been attacked. That was the first I knew about it. And so I dropped her off at school, and I started flipping around the news stations, and I realized that it wasn't just the Pentagon, but one of the towers had been hit at the World Trade Center. And I remember thinking that this is going to change this whole day. I had an interview scheduled. I don't even remember what it's about, but I walked into the station and everyone was just gathered around the monitors. Everybody was just shocked. I remember we watched as the tower collapsed, because, no one actually thought that it would collapse, because after the first plane hit, everyone was like, is this an accident, or is this an attack, or what just happened? But after the second plane hit, everyone knew it had to be some sort of a terrorist attack, especially since the Pentagon had been hit too. So nobody could have imagined that the tower would actually collapse, just standing there with so many people who have opinions about everything, just standing there in utter shock and silence and just disbelief that this is happening. So then it's like, what do we do now? From a local news standpoint, nothing in Omaha, Nebraska that day seemed to matter. Anything that we had planned to cover just didn't matter. I mean, it put things in such a different perspective. We might have made it on the air for maybe a half hour, but pretty much all the local shows were preempted. It just changed the way we covered news for weeks because of the fact that it was such a horrific event. It just put things in such a different perspective. We interviewed a few people who were at the Warren Buffett charity golf tournament to see what they were going through, and we interviewed Warren Buffett to see what he made of the whole situation. And there were so many unanswered questions at that point. Nobody really knew who exactly was responsible, so it was just, again, like I said, a whole lot of shock and just disbelief and like, what in the world just happened? It's hard to put into words. I had been to New York several times. My husband went to New York University, and we went up to the top of the World Trade Center, stood up at the top, and you just try to imagine what it must have been like for those people, all that heat, jet fuel burning. And then I think about the people jumping, and just that choice between burning to death or collapsing or jumping. And those pictures will always be etched in my mind forever. It's just really, really hard to fathom. We've been really spoiled as US citizens. We're not used to having any kind of war or terrorist attack. I mean, it really challenges your sense of safety. And you think of kids, and that's like the last thing that you want them to feel is unsafe. And, you know, in other places like the Middle East, I don't want to say anyone's used to having that sort of a thing happen, but it's more of a common occurrence. You know, we had never had anything like that before. And so it kind of made us realize that we're just people too, and we're just as vulnerable as anybody else. And, you know, we have an attack of this magnitude on our soil, and it wakes you up. It does. And, you know, but on the other hand, you have to think, you know, we have to be more sensitive to what goes on to people in other places and parts of the world too. And if anything, I think this definitely did make us more sensitive to what goes on in those places too.
I went to New York for the first time, and I went out on September 6th, and I flew back on September 10th. On September 9th, which was a Sunday, I went over to the World Trade Center, went up into the observation deck, and walked around. When I first made my plans to go out there, my plans were to fly back on Tuesday, September 11th, but instead I flew back on September 10th. So I took a bus to go over to Newark, which was right at the base of the World Trade Center. And had I gone with my original plan, I would have been at the base of the World Trade Center when the first plane hit. I feel fortunate I wasn't there when the plane hit. I couldn't imagine what I'd be feeling standing there and that plane hitting and glass and metals and explosions just right above my head. I went out there to visit my friend who had just moved out to New York, and the next morning I was in my office, and my office is in St. Patrick's Church in Battle Creek, Nebraska, and I had woken up for early morning mass and called him to let him know that I just got back safely, and he was in his office, and his office was right across the street from the World Trade Center. He was in One Liberty Plaza, which was the building right across the street. So then I got into my car and the radio was on, and that was all the news that was on. So I ran inside and turned the TV on, and that's right when the second plane hit. So I grabbed the phone and tried to get a hold of that friend of mine. Wasn't able to get through to him all day. About 4 in the afternoon, he got a call through. Cell service was terrible in New York that day, trying to get calls in and out. And he'd been trying a bunch of different numbers and people, and I was the first one he was able to get out to. So he gave me a list of parents and friends and family to get a hold of to let them know that he was safe. I remember back at the World Trade Center, we were walking towards the elevator, and we didn't see the sign that said wet floor. And there was some maintenance guy there mopping, and I was just thinking, wondering, was he in the building when it happened? Because I can remember his face so clearly from the 2 days before, from him yelling at us and us looking over at him. Or the people that worked in the concessions area, up in the observation deck. Were they there when it happened? I feel a great sense of sympathy and empathy for the people that were there and for the families that lost loved ones. I can still picture the maintenance guy's face and the woman in concessions. And all those feelings come back, and they're just right there.
I happened to be in New York City. I was there on business, and I was in my room at the World Trade Center Marriott, which people in New York know as the Vista whenever I tell them that. It's the hotel right there in between the towers, essentially. And I was on the 6th floor, and I was in my room when that morning when the events began. I was preparing for an arbitration hearing, going over some notes from the previous day, and preparing for that day's continuing of the arbitration hearing, when I felt something. And I was just, as I said, the hotel is a long building. It was only 12 or 14 stories tall, but it was very long in between the two towers. The towers were kind of kitty-cornered to each other, and it ran beside the north tower, in front of the south tower, if you will, on West Side Highway. And I was only on the 6th floor, and I felt the building shook, like I imagine, though I've never been in one. It felt kind of like an earthquake. And when that happened, I went and stuck my head out the door, and it was like a bunch of gophers popping out of their holes. Everyone was looking up and down the hallway, and I turned to the person whose room was next to me, and I said it felt like a plane had hit our building. Closed the door, went back inside, and it seemed like seconds. It was probably maybe a minute or two. Opened the windows, and looking out on West Side Highway had gone from, as you can imagine, 8 in the morning, New York City, rush hour traffic on a busy highway, to no traffic, and like 6 fire trucks in front of the building. And it couldn't have been, it had to be less than 5 minutes. And there's debris, and I remember thinking, well, my next thought was that a crane or something had fallen off the building, or something like that. I had no context in which to put what had happened. Turned on the TV, and at that point they thought a small plane had run into one of the buildings. I happened to be right across from an elevator bank with windows out the other side of the building, so I went out and looked down, and there's debris, and I could see where the plane had hit the north tower, and there's just debris raining down. It looked like confetti coming down. And looking down, you could see like a seat of a chair and some stuff, and there was a roof a couple of floors down. And I was just trying to figure out what had happened. I was there with an attorney who was representing our company. She was staying a couple of rooms down, so I went down and knocked on her door. And at that point, everyone's just trying to figure out what had happened. She's trying to get a hold to see if our meeting is still on or not with people. And she's having trouble with cell phone service. I noticed I was too. Come to find out, several things. Everyone was on their cell phone. And secondly, it got worse as the day went on, because one of the biggest cell phone towers on the East Coast was on top of the World Trade Center there. As you can imagine, be a pretty good place to put one. We're deciding what we should do, and by then the second plane had hit, and we knew it was not an accident, and they were not small planes that had accidentally hit it. We got down to the lobby, and they looked at us like we were crazy. I think we were a couple of the last people to leave. And one of my strongest images from that day was at that point, all of the firemen were just pouring into the lobby. And I happened to be wearing a dark suit, except for the nameplate. I looked just like a hotel employee. I looked like a manager. And so I had firemen coming up to me, asking me directions places. Of course, I was not very equipped to handle. And I remember one fireman was quite perturbed with me when I said, well, I think the North Tower is that way. I realized that he thought I worked there and should probably be a little more help than I was being. But then at that point, they said, we need to get you out of the building. So we crossed Vesey Street, which is on the south end of the hotel. They ran us across there because we were pretty close to the South Tower where we were. So we crossed there, and then we went across West Side Highway. And I remember we were just looking up at the destruction in awe. And we saw a lot of things that people talked about in terms of, people making decisions that you can't ever imagine having to make when you're hundreds of stories in the air. You've got two choices. One is to burn to death, and the other is to take a leap. So we observed some of that, and we were just kind of mesmerized. I remember Susan saying, I think we should be running because we were just across the street from the South Tower, probably a little further away from the North Tower. But we turned and started kind of running down West Side Highway south, which is what they said. They said, head south, get as far away as you can. And we got about 2 blocks away, and then the South Tower started to fall. I just remember the distinct sound. You could hear each floor. You could hear it go boom, 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 boom. You could almost count each floor being crushed. And we kept running. We got a couple of blocks further away, and the plume of dust, just about as it overtook us, we turned the corner towards Hudson West. And it got very dark, and we're just feeling along, and we come to some sort of a building with doors. And there was a door here, and we were trying to get inside. There were people on the other side motioning to us. What they were trying to get us to do was use the revolving door in the middle, so I wouldn't let in all of the dust. So we get into this lobby. It was a small lobby. it was an apartment, but there were probably 150 people in there, and this was the first time that I was able to get a hold of my wife. She was pretty frantic, but I was able to talk to her and tell her, hey, I'm all right, we got away. We're not very far away, but we're away. But when this plume of dust went over, I mean, it's just absolute darkness when this happened. And we were there for, seemed like forever. It was probably a couple of hours that we were there. And then the North Tower then fell as well. But going back to when we were in the building, when I made my various trips downstairs to see what was happening and what we should do, I ran into an older gentleman. He reminded me a little bit of my father. I talked to him briefly on Sunday, and it turns out he was staying on our floor. And when we were getting ready to leave, when we were going down, he opened his door, and I said, "You've got to come with us." He says, "No." I'm like, "No, you've got to come with us." He says, "Well, I'll be right behind you. I'm going to grab a few things." And, so we left. We didn't know that both towers were going to collapse on that building. And about 10 minutes after we left, the South Tower fell. And so all day I'm just thinking about him because, I thought his fate had been determined by when the South Tower fell. So we're in this lobby, and a policeman and a fireman come in when the dust had literally settled. And they said words that, I thought I'd only hear in a Steven Spielberg movie, which is, we need to evacuate the island, meaning Manhattan. So they said, "Follow us." And they took us to Southport, which is in Battery Park. And anything that had a motor and floated, they're just throwing people on it and sending it over to New Jersey. And that was on the south tip of Manhattan. If you're on the other side of the island, I think they're sending you to Queens or to Brooklyn. So we get on this police boat that's the occupancy of maybe 14 people, and there were 35 of us in all. So we got on that boat, and they sent us to Liberty State Park, which is close to the Statue of Liberty. And we got out of the boat, and we're walking down the pier, and who should get out of the boat in front of us but this gentleman that we had seen in the hotel that we run into a couple of times. And he was covered in dust. He was actually in the hotel stairwell when the building collapsed, and firemen had to lower him down with ropes to get him out, but he was alive. And we were walking towards Hudson. About 5 cars were stopped. People were just fleeing. They asked us if we needed a ride. And I think something should be said. The country, I think, found out through 9/11 that New York City, they're not the cold-hearted, hard people that we think they are. In a crisis situation, they're good people that care about and want to help people in need. But my phone, it had worked a couple of times that day. We got a hold of some people at my work, and Susan had gotten a hold of her husband, and he called a few friends and then headed out to pick us up. I think he got about to Atlantic, and one of his friends called him back, said that he'd go with him. So he turned around to pick him up because it's a 24-hour drive practically. And we went to a hotel. They had rooms. We were lucky on so many levels that day. It's hard to imagine. We spent the night. The next morning, her husband and his friend showed up, and we got in the car and just started driving. Drove through the night, taking turns, and got back Thursday morning. Thursday about noon, we were back in Omaha, and my son, my middle child, he was in kindergarten at the time. My youngest was home with my wife, and I remember when I got home, not to compare myself with them, but I understand what a soldier feels when he comes home from war and gets to hug his wife and children again. And I picked up my son from school that day. Those are things I'll never forget.
My whole family lives in New York. 2 uncles, my aunt, and 3 of my cousins all work in New York City. My aunt and uncle are executive types. My other uncle and those 3 cousins are all electricians, so they were all there at the time of the attacks. Well, I'll tell you an interesting story, and it might sound kind of crazy, but I was sleeping. I was in college in Minnesota, and lots of times I have these premonition types of dreams before they happen. So I was dreaming that my uncles and my cousin were on some type of Arabic caravan, and they were being held hostage, and they got attacked. So when I woke up, I was already like, oh my goodness, like something bad happened. So I tried to call my uncle, and there wasn't any answer. And I tried to call one of my cousins, and there wasn't any answer. And as I turned on my TV, it was the second plane hitting, so I actually witnessed on the TV the second plane hitting the towers. So after that, and because of my dream, I freaked out, and I started calling everybody in my family in New York, and nobody was able to get a hold of them. And when we finally got a hold of 3 of them, those 3 met up, and they didn't have any way home. Everything was obviously all shut down. So they told me they were just walking with the crowds of people in the tunnels. Come to find out, one of my cousins, one of the electricians, was working in a building next to Twin Towers, and he witnessed the first plane, and I think it was the engine from the second plane, hit the roof of the building that he was working in. So he was helping people, and I don't think they ever reported it on the news, but there was actually some fatalities in that building because of the engine landing on the roof. He was 2 floors below whatever top floors got hit by the engine. So he was a part of it, even though he wasn't in the Twin Towers. Then another one of my cousins, I don't know where he was exactly at the time of the attacks, but he witnessed both. And so those 2 cousins were helping people, and people were scrambling around and screaming, and it was just chaotic, and we couldn't get a hold of them. And it really, really traumatized them both. It affected me because I'm an only child, and my cousins are like my brothers. So I knew them living in New York, those kinds of attacks and stuff, they're at the core of that kind of stuff. So afterwards, it was just worrying if something else was going to happen, you know, just really worrying about them.
I grew up in Council Bluffs, actually, and I moved to New York City in 1977 to pursue a career in acting, performing, and was still living there in 2001 when that happened. I lived there till 2007, and no, I haven't been back since. I don't miss it at all. 30 years was enough for me. So I probably lived, I don't know how many blocks to a mile, but I don't know, 40, 50 blocks uptown from the Trade Center, and I had a beautiful view of the towers from my apartment building. I was on my way to work. The subway was about 2 blocks away from where I lived. It was a typical, well, as you know from reading the reports, it was a beautiful, beautiful day. Just a beautiful September day, and sun, warm. So I left my apartment building, and I'm hearing all these sirens, which is nothing unusual in New York City on a weekday morning, so I didn't. You know, I'm just walking along, not paying any attention. You know when you're just lost in thought, you don't even notice what's going on around you? So as I got closer to my subway entrance, I'm thinking, wow, that's really a lot of sirens. And then I noticed I was hearing helicopters. And I thought, well, gosh, something big must be going on. So I'm getting pretty close to that subway entrance, which was on a busy street, 7th Avenue in New York. And I noticed that there was this throng of people standing around. Like even in the street, traffic was just stopped. And everybody was staring downtown. So I walked up, and I looked to where they were all looking, and I saw that one of the trade towers was on fire. And you could see the smoke, and you could see the flames shooting out on the side of the building. So I stood there for a few minutes, and everybody's just kind of talking to each other and watching. And I remember going up to this woman, complete stranger, and I said, what is going on? She says, we don't know, but it just happened. People are saying maybe it's a gas explosion, or maybe like some small plane went off course and hit the side of the building. She said, we don't know. So I thought, not realizing how big this was, I thought, well, let me go into my subway entrance, jump the train. It took me maybe 10 minutes to get to work. Okay, so in that 10 minutes that I was in the subway, unbeknownst to me, the second tower got hit. So the subway stops right at the Time and Life building where I work, so I wasn't hearing word out on the street or anything. So I go right up into my building, take the elevator up, and I walked in, and everybody's just outside in the hallway, outside of their offices, and everybody's just, you know, and I said, what's going on? What happened at the Trade Center? And they said, you didn't hear? The second tower was just hit. It's terrorism. Oh my God. And everybody was just stunned. It was just, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, over and over and over again. And, not really comprehending yet. You're saying terrorism, but you don't realize just yet the ramifications of that and how it's going to change everything from here on. The image that keeps coming back in an almost haunting way is walking south, which was toward the trade centers, and seeing this beautiful sky, beautiful clear blue sky, and where the trade centers should have been, this image that I had seen time after time, day after day, year after year, was this plume of just ugly smoke coming just up into this clear blue sky. That's the thing I remember the most. I always think about that. Because see, I lived close enough that they cordoned off my neighborhood, and for about a week, I had to show ID to get into my own neighborhood, and I couldn't open my windows for weeks because the smell in the air was just, it's really hard to describe. It's like a combination of jet fuel, plastic, metal. It was just this awful thing that I'd never smelled before, and unfortunately, human remains probably in there too, but it was just, you just didn't want to breathe that in, and now we know all the problems they've had with illnesses. I want to mention one other image besides the smoke. This isn't so much an image, but an incident. St. Vincent's Hospital, huge hospital in New York that's since closed. That was my neighborhood hospital. It was just a couple blocks away from me, and they had set up, outside of there, they had set up a triage to bring in the survivors to. So I went over that evening, or later that afternoon. I walked over because I wanted to see ambulances bringing survivors. And there was this whole throng there, crowd of people, and we wanted to applaud. We wanted to applaud the EMTs and all of the rescuers, and no ambulances came. None. There were no survivors. And it was becoming clearer and clearer, and everybody's just standing around looking south, waiting for these ambulances to start arriving. Not one. And that was chilling.
I'm from Omaha, but I went to college in New York City, and I lived there for 15 years. I worked for the Hyatt Hotels and Resorts in Midtown Manhattan. I worked as a concierge for the VIP level, and I took care of certain companies. I was on the 37th floor of the Hyatt Hotel, and I actually heard a plane. And in Manhattan, you never hear a plane. It was the most eerie thing, but I was watching Good Morning America, and as I was watching it, that's when the first plane hit. And I was still in that space, and alarms were going off, and people were coming back to the hotel, and that's when the second plane hit. And just walking out into the street, you could see people who were burned or injured, and you knew that they had to be in the World Trade Center. And walking out into the streets, you could smell death. You could smell what it would smell like if someone was burning. I'll never forget that smell. But because I was there that day, my boss thought it'd be best that I stay in New York the 2 weeks following that New York was in lockdown, just so the people in the hotel could have a friendly face. Once the lockdown was over and we opened up our hotel, all the companies that were down at the World Trade Center, they had lost all their employees. So they used our hotel to house family members. And in the hotel, there were vigils set up, and it was just all these people who were trying to come and connect with the people they had lost. The days and weeks following, there were constant threats. There were military people, CIAs, FBIs, everyone was there. We were right down the street from the United Nations. We were across the street from the Chrysler building, and every day it was just all my employees, who were these older women who did housekeeping, walking down 40 and 50 flights of stairs, and it was just so sad. And I remember people came and they wanted to go to the Today Show. So they would ask for markers and a poster board down at the concierge desk in the main lobby. And I remember the first person that came and said, "Do you have markers and a poster board?" And I said, "Oh, are you going to the Today Show?" And they said, "No, we're just trying to put up signs." And it was just all these people who were looking for their lost loved ones. My best friend worked for American Express, and one of his employees turned back to the World Trade Center, and this was when people were jumping out of the buildings. And she said, "Thank God they're catching them." And I thought, in your mind, you try and create what you want to believe, because people couldn't believe that this was really happening. She thought that they were jumping and they were going to be saved and everything would be okay, because you just can't ever imagine anything else.
I was in bed. Yeah, I lived in Flushing, Queens, which is the end of the 7 train. So I was going to school in Queens College at the time, and we didn't have morning classes. It was a Tuesday morning, I think, so I was sleeping in. I was the first one up in my apartment. I must have been up shortly after the second plane hit, because it had happened. But the first one up in my apartment, got all my roommates up, and I mean, we just stared at the TV for a couple of hours, you know. Obviously, school was canceled, you know, nobody, you could smell the debris. It was pretty weird, you know, it was like a haze over the whole city. And Queens is a long way, like 200 blocks, 163 blocks from the river, from Manhattan. So that's a long way for that dust to be going. What else happened that day? Well, you couldn't ride the subway, you couldn't ride the city bus, you couldn't get cash out of an ATM. You know, you couldn't use your credit card to buy gas. You couldn't go anywhere. It was pretty weird in a city like that, you know. We didn't have cars or anything, so you're kind of stranded. I had friends who walked from Manhattan home to Queens, who were working downtown that morning. And everyone was at home, everything shut down, and they walked 8 hours, you know, September 11th. You know, it's just like here, middle of summer, 90 degrees, and walking in flip-flops for 8 hours because you couldn't get over the bridge with a car, any of the bridges with a car, couldn't ride the subway, just seas of people walking away from the city. I never really went to Lower Manhattan because, you know, but the city definitely was different for a couple of months. It was totally different. People weren't out at night, and it was just really scary. And especially, you know, people thought that things were going to keep happening. There was a plane crash in Queens. I don't know if you know too much about that, but 2 months later, there was a plane crash that was supposedly a shoe bomber, and that was like a couple of miles from my place. And of course, that wasn't a shoe bombing. That was just a really unfortunate accident that they finally realized a couple of years later. They finally figured that out. But I don't know how to describe it. It was pretty scary. The city was, I went out Friday night afterwards, and the city was dead. And I don't know if you've ever been to New York City, but you walk down the street and there isn't a crowd of people. It's pretty weird, and it was just barren. It was really creepy. And when you live in New York, you learn that when you're by yourself, that's when you should be afraid, because there's always safety in numbers there, you know? You never go down a street that looks sketchy with no one on it, or one person on it when you're by yourself, you know? It was really weird.
It was, please correct me if I'm wrong, but for some reason in my head, I believe it was a Tuesday morning. I had class, believe it was script analysis class, and I'm pretty sure it was supposed to be at 9:30 Central Time. I had taken a shower. I was living with my girlfriend at the time, my wife now, and I just got out of the shower and my phone was ringing, and I let it ring while I got dressed. And then I finally went and realized that she had called me several times while I had been in the shower. I immediately called her back, thinking the worst, obviously, and she'd asked if I turned the TV on. I never did before school. I said, "Why? What's going on?" She said, "You need to turn the TV on." So I turned it on, and it was the Today Show, I think. And I know the instant I turned it on, like within minutes, saw the second plane hit. And it was just, I just remember being so confused. I know I never turned the TV off. I basically just sat watching the news, hearing the same stories over and over again, having to watch. This part gets me every time. Having to watch the footage was the toughest part. And I'll never forget that, about that day. When it happened and how it happened is very clear to me. But the part that gets me every time is remembering the footage. Still tough. For about 5 years afterwards, every day on 9/11, I would fast for 24 hours. It seems silly in retrospect, but for at least 5 years, I just didn't know how to deal with how it affected me. It affected me very, very deeply. Knowing people that lived there at the time, that worked there at the time, they remember running out of the financial district across the Brooklyn Bridge just to hide. And having talked to them, I feel like it's incredibly personal to them, and that I'm stealing that by being affected as much as I was. I realize that that's something that's natural for most Americans to feel in some way, so I don't feel as bad about it now, which is why I stopped doing fast and started being just a little more active in voicing my opinions and views in politics, I guess. I'm trying, I'm very politically engrossed in politics and the way they affect us. And I'm trying more and more not to demonize people who view things in the other way that I do. In situations like this, I feel like it's impossible not to demonize people who do something like this. You can't, it's a demonic thing. It's an evil, heartless, cold, destructive thing.
Okay, my connection to New York. Well, at the time I was in college, and that was my freshman year, and I heard about the first tower being hit on my way to school that morning, and I had theater history, I think is what it was, and it was kind of this buzz going around. No one really understood the scope of it or how intense the whole thing was. It was maybe kind of easily dismissed. Then the second tower was hit. And I remember there was this weird rumor going around like that, hey, the Sears Tower has been hit, and all these other major cities across the United States. But you know, my connection to New York at the time wasn't too severe, but even in Lincoln, Nebraska, people were canceling classes, and it was this nationwide result after these events, and that's pretty heavy duty if you could imagine this one event where people are canceling classes and going home from work to be with their loved ones, or just stopping what they're doing so they can watch TV or whatever they do. I didn't really have that, but at the time I was rehearsing for this play I was in, and it was dealing with kind of the same Middle Eastern political situations. It was about these hostage negotiations in Beirut. It was written in like the 90s, but there was a time when we actually had to go to the dean and the head of the department saying, you know, can we still do this play, or does it have too much of a political and emotional effect? And they said, sure, no, we should go on with it. And we should have talkbacks afterwards, saying, you know, does this play mean more than it would have, you know, when it was originally written? Or, you know, can this play continue to evolve as time goes on? And we opened 10 days after 9/11, and it was kind of controversial. People really didn't know what to exactly think about it. Even if they weren't sure what it was about, they kind of wanted to come see it. And they even came up to us saying, we may have to extend the show because this may be something people really want to see. And we figured, well, they're either going to really, really like it and maybe find it educational or even cathartic, or they're going to really, really hate it and, maybe find it kind of offensive and, we shouldn't be talking about this right now. But they actually really liked it. We were sold out every night. And before and afterwards a couple times, we had people from different departments of the college come and talk about different political stuff happening at the time, stuff that branched off the main subject. But, that's really the most that affected me in these roundabout ways, and for a lack of a better term, history repeating itself and how it affected my life through art. Boy, that sounds really artsy-fartsy.
I was going to at Michigan at the time, and my dad was an airline pilot. And when the World Trade Center happened, my dad was still flying at the time, and the only thing I knew when that happened, that my dad was on a trip. United Airlines was one of the planes that was attacked, and that one of those planes was the same type that my dad flew. So, I actually slept through the initial attacks. My now wife, the girlfriend, woke me up and told me what was going on. And I immediately started freaking out, because who knows, my dad could have been on there or not. I was trying to get a hold of my mom, and I was so angry at that time. Just how long it took everyone who wasn't family, who they sort of knew my dad. I'm alright with family and friends calling, but 6 hours before I actually got through to her and found out that he was in London. My dad still flew afterwards. Everybody was scared at that time. I was freaking out that, that it could happen again. So I finally went up and talked to my dad about it, because every time we went on a trip, I was freaking out. And he told me that before 9/11, what airline pilots were told to do was basically just whatever the terrorists want, you do it. Because before then, what they would do, terrorists would get on there and hijack the plane, and they'd want to go to Cuba or something and get $1 million and everybody be safe. This was the first time anybody had ever done something like that. So airline pilots at this time were basically told, do whatever you can. Whereas before, they couldn't do anything. They would have been fired if they tried to do anything. My dad was an Air Force pilot before, so he informed me that if a terrorist would ever try and take his plane, that he would pull the plane into an inverted dive. So flip over and go straight down. Therefore, anybody who wasn't buckled up would be a pancake. Before 9/11, the country was safe. And it hadn't been since Pearl Harbor that anybody done anything. And that was on Hawaii, and way before I was born. So you never even thought about the fact that, this could happen. It's insane. It's finally calming down a little bit, but still, you don't think of the country as safe anymore.
I remember the next time I flew, how anxious I was. I flew back out to New York about 6 weeks later, mid-October, and just how suspiciously I was looking at everybody on the plane. And I remember that particular trip in October, and the guy sitting in front of me, he looked like he may have been a Middle Eastern descent, and he was kind of anxious. And then he started stretching like this, and I noticed he had a watch on, and I noticed his watch was already set back to Central Time. And for some reason, it just kind of clicked, and I thought, oh, well, he set his watch back. I'm sure he's not going to blow up the plane. And I was able to relax him for that moment. I think in the day-to-day, we can't survive thinking constantly, being so cautious all the time and suspicious all the time. So it doesn't have that impact. that impact until I really sit down and think about it. I would say, especially right afterwards, it was the realization of just how fragile life is. And I'm reminded of it every once in a while. Tragedies like this, and we tend to forget that and move on with our daily lives. Whether it was something like this, which was instigated by a bunch of people wanting to cause that harm, or just an accident that could just happen, and just how quickly life could change for individuals, for families, and the broader communities too.
I remember that day I was really scared. My family is Indian. I grew up Muslim, and I was afraid that it was Muslims who did it because I didn't know what kind of repercussions there would be. That same day, I was getting my driver's license. I had an appointment at the DMV on 24th Street, and right as I was there waiting to take my test, Air Force One flew over going to Offutt, and everybody just got kind of still and ducked. After that, I was driving to where I was staying. I was staying with my mother-in-law, and all I knew of Omaha really was L Street because she lives on 78th and L, and South High is on 24th and L. So I'm driving down L Street in my little Ford Fiesta wearing one of my African dresses, and a guy in a big red pickup truck tried to run me off the road and kept bumping into me quite a few times down L Street, kept screaming things at me. I don't know what he was saying because I rolled my windows up, and it was a hot day, and it was just this tiny car and this huge red truck. So I ended up running a few red lights, and I drove straight to the Ralston police station. I just laid down on the horn, and he left me alone after that. When I got home, my mother-in-law was there, and she was watching what was happening on the TV, and she was very scared for me after I told her what happened, and she said, "I don't know if I want you going out on the roads alone anymore," and I said, "I'll be fine." I remember that very same week I was at the Hy-Vee on 36th and L, and there was a lady in the canned vegetables aisle, and people were throwing cans at her and telling her to go back to her own country. And I'm like, okay, she kind of looks like me, but she was Hispanic, so I guess I don't know the difference between who's who. I don't know. But I went in there, and she had a little boy with her, and a 3 or 4-year-old little boy, and he was screaming stop, and she was really scared, and she wasn't really saying much. So I went in there, and I grabbed her, and I pulled her out of the aisle. So there was that one incident, and I'm sure there's been many more the years since, but that was the scariest one because it was literal physical force. You know, I told my grandfather I wanted to become a teacher and come back home to Kenya to teach, and he said, "Don't do it, you'll never be hired, and if you are hired, you will not be treated as an equal. You'll hit a glass ceiling and you won't get as far as you can and should," and I didn't believe him at the time. I thought he was just being, difficult, but he's since passed, and I've seen my sisters who have hit that glass ceiling, and they haven't gotten it as far as they can, and I know, and everybody else knows, it's because of the color of their skin. I just thought when I came to America, things would be different. Then 9/11 happened, and it's not different.
I was in my dining room, and it was breakfast time, and I hadn't seen TV in like a week. And so while I was having breakfast with my daughter and my son, for some reason, I just flipped on the TV, and I saw smoke coming out of the first tower. At first, they just said a plane collided. We thought, someone went off course and hit the tower. And we sat there for a little while, and we saw the second plane. And what popped into my head was, we're Muslims. I hope this wasn't a Muslim who did this. As an American, I was devastated, absolutely devastated that our country didn't protect us from that. And as a Muslim, we're on the new hate list of the hate list in America. So there's two emotions going on there, as an American and as a Muslim. My parents are very straight, white American Christians, and here their daughter is this Muslim, so they're very torn too. Their devotion and dedication to this country, and then me, I'm an outcast in my own family because I changed my religion. So that's just another big struggle within our family. You know, I faced hate. I faced being spit on in department stores. I faced being driven off the road because they'll see a scarf or a headscarf. Friends of mine have been thrown cans at and hit in the head. People are not being hired in this city of Omaha because they're Muslim. Not just when that happened, but to this day. And to this day, there are still groups that hate us because in their minds, we still represent September 11th.
I was in Ecuador in the Peace Corps at the time, in a country where I didn't know the language, but what they do is they throw you down there and you learn it. And I'll never forget the morning of 9/11 because 9/11 is my birthday. And at the time, my wife and I were living in the annex of this grass hut. And in this hut, the neighbors felt bad for us because, I mean, we were even poorer than they were. And so they let us borrow this black and white TV. But we also had a radio downstairs in the kitchen, and so I went downstairs to the kitchen to make some oatmeal. And I had the radio on. And I could make out World Trade Center and bomb. And I just thought it was the anniversary of the day they put those bombs in the basement. And so I asked my wife, she said she didn't know. But they just kept talking about it, and so I was like, if there's really something going on, I can go upstairs and look at the TV. And so I finished my oatmeal, turned off the radio, and I went upstairs, and I turned on the television, and there it was. There was like smoke coming out of the World Trade Center. And it's in black and white. I'm trying to see what's going on. I'm only getting bits and pieces of what's happening. And I called my wife. I was like, Vic, you gotta come see this. There's smoke coming out of the World Trade Center. And they're talking about airplanes and terrorists, and I don't know if it's just a fire or what's going on. And my wife and I, we weren't really freaking out because we didn't know what was happening. And so we wanted to go into town and see what was going on and get online because they had internet cafes there. And when we got there, everything was fine, but as we got closer to downtown, we started to see people staring at the TVs in the shop windows. They were just stopping and staring. And we're used to weird looks since, you know, we were white, and you can always tell who the Americans are in a foreign country. And there just weren't many of us in the area, and Ecuador isn't really the most pro-America place, but I remember how compassionate people were. And reading in the paper the next day that Ecuador was willing to send troops to America. And everyone was just sort of rallying around the USA because of 9/11 and how awful it was. And now I remember when the US decided to go to war, and my wife and I had to explain some things that were pretty hard to explain. And some things we just couldn't explain. And when the US went off on its own, and it was sort of like, if you're not with us, you're against us, that didn't really fly. And all that goodwill that could have been used for so much good was just wasted. And that's pretty much what I remember from that time. And since I wasn't in America, I didn't have to deal with some of the things that those who were did, like the constant talk of it, being bombarded by the media, and having those images seared into your brain. That's what I didn't understand, because I wasn't around it all the time. And the most striking thing was when we got back, people had changed. And when we got there, the Iraq War had started, and I was stuck there thinking, why are we doing this? And I even had an article in the local newspaper about why I thought it was wrong. But people in my town were so mad that I had written that. Like, how could you say that? You're not a patriot. And I didn't intend for it to sound anti-American. It was just like, maybe we should think about this. And I even had 2 friends who had died in the Iraq War, but people were so whooped up from this event that I just couldn't understand it. And to come back after your country has changed so much, it's like I didn't have a home anymore. Like I didn't belong anymore. And some people just don't realize what we've lost. And sometimes I really think Bin Laden won. And not because he killed all those people, but if he wanted to destroy our economy and change our way of life, then he won, really. People don't want to hear that, but I do love my country. I'll tell you that much. And what happened was so terrible, and Bin Laden did so much to damage this country. It's just like, did he win? Are we cutting our own throats because of our own fear? I don't know. I really just don't know.
For me, that moment, 9/11 was, there was a bunch of moments in my life that were similar in some respects. That I had this incredible feeling that the world's fabric had just been ripped in. And these things don't happen. And for me, it was the JFK assassination, the Robert Kennedy assassination, the Martin Luther King assassination, the Iran hostage crisis. All these moments, and I remember thinking, wait a minute, these things don't happen, We have rules against this. We don't behave like this. And I just remember being amazed on how the world just seemed to go on. And I remember very clearly the day that JFK died. And they came over the PA system and they announced it. And I think I was in 3rd grade. But then they just sent us out to recess. And I remember thinking, recess? How the hell do you go out to recess? The president was just killed. And it was something like that the morning of 9/11. It was like, oh my God, they just flew planes into and the world just seems to go on, You don't do that. You just don't pretend like it's any other day. Do you know what I mean? So that morning, 9/11, I guess I really didn't know what to make of it, I was just horrified by the sheer tragedies of it. So as the connections developed to Afghanistan, I actually began to feel hopeful that we would intervene, which is a strange feeling for me because I'm a pacifist. So I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Afghanistan during the time of the communist takeover, and I think that was April of '78. And I lived there for another 9 months under the communist rule, and in those times, people started disappearing. People were arrested. People were apprehended. They were told not to have anything to do with me, so they'd just come up to me and not want anything to do with me. Yeah. And, so by the time I left, there were only like 2 people that came by to say goodbye, and they both told me, don't write to us. They'll kill us if they find out. When the time is right and everything settles down, we'll get a hold of you. So I was back for several years before I heard from any of them. And one was a good friend of mine, who was actually a colleague of mine, and I later saw Basir and hooked up with him in Stuttgart, Germany. And he just told me stories about what would happen in those 23, 24 years, and the U.S. distributed pamphlets just to warn the people there that the attacks were coming, and or like the Taliban, they would park their vehicles in residential neighborhoods, and they'd they just say how like creepy strategic the strikes were. Like they'd hit a tank with a missile, but the tank would be parked next to a school, and it would just hit the tank and not the school. So everybody felt real hopeful that maybe the Taliban were being driven out, and we would intervene, and Afghanistan can really regrow and rebuild. So the time I lived there, Afghanistan was a very tolerant place, The people were Muslim in the same way that most Christian Americans are Christian, They weren't wacko, they weren't disrespectful. I was always told that they respected us because we have a book, just like the Jewish people have a book and the Muslim people have a book. So the fundamentalist Islam is, that the Taliban cloaked themselves in was a foreign of Afghanistan. It's the kind that grew up in refugee camps in Pakistan. So they were all delighted, and they all felt real hopeful that, the 30 years of violence, the communist takeover, the Soviet invasion, the civil wars, the Taliban, everything was going to be destroyed, and Afghanistan can just rebuild itself. So for me, that's really all connected to the fall of the towers.
Alright, so here's a story, and the story is a little secondhand, but I'm a big Batman fan. And there's this one guy who, in the entire animated series of Batman, it's the same guy over and over, and his name is Kevin Conroy. So 9/11 happens, and he's living in New York. And he wants to help out, but he doesn't really know how. So he figures, well, I've been an actor for 30 years. I guess I could go serve food at the hospital. So essentially, he's waiting tables. So he's working the graveyard shift at the hospital, like 3 in the morning. And, the firefighters are there. They're just sitting there, tired, eating their food. And he's talking to one of his supervisors. And that's when one of the firefighters says, wait, did anyone else just hear Batman? And they all freeze. And then they just go back to talking. So Kevin doesn't really know what to do with this. So he just continues what he was doing. That's when another firefighter says, wait, I hear Batman. And they all get real quiet. And then they go back to doing what they were doing again. So that's when Kevin decides to say, I am vengeance, I'm the knight, I am Batman! And all the firefighters at the table freak out, and they're like, oh, no way, you're Batman, that's so awesome. And he's signing autographs, and they're telling him all his favorite episodes and how they watch the show with their kids. And he was talking to them saying, you're the people who save people's lives, and I'm just sitting here pretending to be someone who's fake with my voice. And he was saying how cool it was to have this kind of strange impact on these people who are having this very courageous, very life-threatening thing happen to them.
Well, I have, for the past 2012, for the past 4.5 years now, until the beginning of this year, I lived in New York City and worked in New York City. Actually, as of November of 2010, my offices were moved to One Liberty Plaza, which is directly across the street from WTC. So I had a direct 22nd or 24th floor, depending on where I was working at the time, view directly into the construction zone that most people couldn't see until it was open. And I literally got to watch them build that building floor by floor, which was rather amazing. They were averaging, I think, a full floor every 2 weeks, something like that. At least that's what it seemed like to a bunch of morons that were watching from across the way. And I was able to get tickets to attend the opening, not the opening ceremonies, but I was there for the opening weekend of the memorial opening up. And I will say this. The memorial itself is an incredibly beautiful place that I think everyone should try to see. It's shocking having lived in New York for so long. You get used to this constant sound of the city. Cars, people, horns. Never-ending horns, honking at cars that will do absolutely nothing because they're honking at them. But you get used to it. And the first thing I noticed when we walked in, and if you don't know anything about the memorial, they've spaced it out so that I think within 15 years, the plan is that the tree canopy will cover everything. So looking down, all you will see is trees and these 2 giant squares of emptiness where the waterfalls fall. And it's just the most amazing thing. But even now, even with construction, still going in, there are spots in that memorial in the area where, because of the waterfalls, because of the wind in the trees, you hear nothing. You don't hear the city. It's just peaceful. And if anything, it is the perfect place for people to go and think about what happened and think about the people that lost their lives on that day.
It's just strange to look at the skyline and know that there would always be something that's missing, no matter what they do. That it will never change. It'll never get back to what it was. And so there's a sense of loss every time I go to New York. And that continues to this day.
Now I look, it's like before 9/11 and after 9/11. It was just such a pivotal point in our nation's history. When you look at pictures or movies, you're always going to be looking, are the towers there? Oh, no towers, it must be after 9/11. Or if they're really early pictures, But there's always going to be that one period in time in Lower Manhattan where the towers are there, and then they were just gone.
Next time you get a chance, take a look at the Woodman Memorial building. Just take a second look at it. Just a second. And think what it would look like if the same thing were to happen. I tell you, sometimes it just looks like a smaller addition to the World Trade Center. Just take a second to look at it.
We went and visited and saw Ground Zero, and it's almost indescribable what it looked like after the attack. It's just devastating to go from seeing it on TV to seeing the actual rubble, and it's just mind-blowing to think about what happened and that somebody could even do that kind of thing and how people got through it in general.
It changed my outlook on life a little, you know? I was 19 when I was there, still a kid.
My strongest memory from that day was watching Air Force One fly right overhead, like right over my house. And I remember thinking, that's the only thing flying in the country right now. And that's pretty much my only cool experience from that day.
I knew a guy, actually. It's a funny story. I was working at the Holland Center, and I was a runner. And Louis Black was in town, and he was talking to us backstage about 9/11. So he was on the phone with his therapist, and seeing the whole thing happen out his window. And, you know, Louis Black's very, very loud and always kind of stressed out the whole time. And he sees the whole thing happen, and it kind of just puts him in his place. And he stays in his apartment for 3 days just because of the irony of that.
I just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, or the right place at the right time, depending on how you look at it. But it was a humbling experience, something I'll never forget.
There's nothing random in the universe. Everything has a reason, everything has a purpose. Just because we don't understand those connections doesn't mean there's not a cause and effect. There's always a cause, and there's always an effect. I don't use the word accident because I don't believe in it.
There's this one spot they have a tree. I think it's called the Survivor's Tree. And it's an amazing story. It was the one living thing that survived the collapse of these two buildings. Half of it basically had been torn off, and they took this tree and they dug the whole root system out, and they took it down to the Brooklyn Arboretum and nursed it back to health, then took it back up to WTC and planted it. And there's a very simple metal fence around it. There are rosaries hung on it that I think they look like they've been embedded now in the growth of the tree. And it's just amazing. It's at once peaceful and heartbreaking and poignant, and it does everything that it's supposed to do.
I remember the year after it happened, I asked my students, do you want to talk about this? Do you have any feelings? And one boy raised his hand and asked, did you know about it before it happened? And he was insinuating that because I was Muslim, that I was a part of it. I realized the way he had grown up in a sheltered environment in America, he did not understand what it was like to be part of something that ugly and that horrible. They're not given a perspective that allows them to see other human beings as human beings. They're just the others, them, the anonymous. It's a lot easier to bomb somebody when they're anonymous. And on both sides of the equation, if terrorists had seen people here as human beings, you know, with families and feelings and everything else that comes along with being human, then that would not have happened.
Aside from all the racism stuff that happened afterwards, a lot of good stuff happened after this too. People really banded together and showed each other how much we loved each other. So a lot of positive came out of the experience as well. It taught us to really care for one another during these types of events.
I remember hearing about the kindness of New Yorkers, you know. Like, there were people posting signs on the walls looking for this person, and just how well they were treated with such tenderness and compassion by some of the New Yorkers who, oh my God, who just watched their city become so vulnerable, yet they were still able to take care of them. You know, so I guess that's cool, you know. I don't think that we think about that or talk about that enough. The response of the city to the outsiders. Well, I suppose the insiders too.
2 or 3 days later, there was a volleyball game, and the sound in the gym wasn't working. And the choir teacher talking to the student who was going to be singing the national anthem said, you know, the sound system's not working, but I don't think that's going to be a problem this time. He said, you won't have a problem being heard. It'll be dead quiet for the anthem. That memory sticks with me. Everyone connecting more with the idea of country and patriotism and support because of it. It all brought that home.
John Stewart did a little monologue on it, and he talked about that from his window, he used to be able to see the towers. And that day, he looked out his window, the towers weren't there, but the Statue of Liberty was. And that's always stuck with me, just how beautiful that was, what he said.
I still tell my daughter, just kind of, you know, be open with people, be nice, be a good spirit, be thankful that you're alive every day. Don't be haters. This world is too full of haters. You know, so just be nice, be friendly. You know, who cares about your religion? Who cares if people are homosexual? Who cares, you know, if we're a different color? So what? We're all human beings.